Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Mr. Roger Howkins, one of the experts instructed by the inquiry. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Sir, thank you. May I call Mr. Howkins?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Howkins.
Good morning.
I gather you're going to make the oath.
I am going to make the oath.
Right. There should be a testament on the desk there. Have you got? Take the testament in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, sit down and make yourself comfortable.
Thank you very much.
Right. When you're ready, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. First of all, would you please confirm your name?
Roger Ernest Howkins.
Mr. Howkins, good morning. Thank you very much for attending today. First of all, if I can give you some advice as to how to give your evidence today. First of all, if at any time you require a break, please say so. That's not a problem. Secondly, if you could keep your voice up, that would be much appreciated. That's so that the shorthand writer can capture everything you say and capture it accurately. Please don't nod alone to an answer. If you mean yes or no, please say so, as the case may be. And finally, although the intention is that my questions are short and comprehensible, it might well be that they become long and incomprehensible. If that's so, please shout and I'll break it up and try and put a proper question to you. Is that okay?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Now, if we could start with your instructions, and that you were instructed on the 5th of February 2019 to assist the inquiry and its investigation of the lifts at Grenfell Tower. Your instructions are set out in paragraph 1 of your main report, and the reference can be found at RHO 0000003/8. But in summary, you were instructed to consider the following matters. First of all, relevant legislation, regulation and guidance for fire lifts and firefighting lifts in the 1970s, original design and construction. 2005, the first lift refurbishment, and 2012-2016, the second lift refurbishment. Is that right?
That is correct.
Secondly, did the lifts as installed, refurbished in 1972, 2005, and 2012-16 comply with the relevant standards? Is that right?
That's correct.
Thirdly, did the tenant management organisation's policy on firefighting lifts comply with the relevant standards? Is that right?
That is correct.
Fourthly, if they did not, to what extent did they fail to comply, and what impact would this have had on their functionality, particularly with regard to fire safety and their ability to function in a fire? Is that right?
That's correct.
Fifthly, were the lifts maintained to an appropriate standard and in compliance with the relevant standards in industry practice? Is that right?
That's correct.
And finally, how did the lifts perform on the night of the fire? What were the reasons for any failure to perform? Is that right too?
That is correct.
Thank you. Now, you produced your main report in September 2020, and that can be found at RHO 0000003, and 14 appendices came with that report, which can be found at RHO 0000004. Is that right?
That's correct.
And since then, you've also provided a supplementary report in April of this year, which can be found at RHO 0000005, and that was provided following the receipt of additional evidence. Is that right?
That is correct.
And as indicated in the declaration in both those reports, can I take it that you've understood your duty to the inquiry and complied with it?
I have, yes.
And you've given this evidence in the same way as you would to a court of law?
I would, yes.
And are the factual matters set out in both your reports true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
And finally, do those reports taken together accurately set out your opinions on the matters on which you have received instructions?
They do.
Thank you. Now, if I can turn to the first substantive element of your evidence today, and that's your qualifications. Could I ask you to go to RHO 0000004/358. Now, set out there is your CV, but if I can summarise it thus, First of all, you're a consultant in the vertical transportation team at Arup, is that right?
That's correct.
You advise all parts of the firm, both in this country and overseas, on the use of lifts, escalators and passenger conveyors in new developments and the upgrading of existing developments. Is that right?
Correct.
You have an HNC in something called electrical. Is that right?
That's correct.
What is meant by the word electrical here?
It's the HNC electrical qualification. It's a course, a four-year course.
And you have over 50 years of experience in the lift industry. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you've worked as a lift engineer on a number of tall buildings, including 122 Leadenhall Street in the city.
That's correct.
The BT Tower in London.
Correct.
Canada Water in London.
Correct.
And Cork County Hall in the Republic of Ireland.
That's correct.
Now, can I deal first of all with the structure of my questioning today? I'm going to ask you about the principal conclusions set out in your principal and supplementary reports. Generally speaking, I shall follow the structure of both of those reports in my examination of you. But before we get into the detail, I thought it would be useful if we just discuss briefly the basics of lifts themselves. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Now, can we turn to page 114 of Dr. Lane's original presentation to this inquiry, which can be found at BLA 0005481/114. Now, this is a diagram showing the various components of a lift system. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, starting with the diagram on the left-hand side of this page, what would you find within the lift well?
I'd expect all the lift equipment, which is shown on the right-hand side.
Thank you. Now, what are the guide rails and what do they do?
The guide rails guide the lift car up and down the lift shaft, and also they guide the counterweight up and down the lift shaft.
Now, looking at the lift car itself, that is shown on the diagram at the right-hand side of the page. Can you explain for us how the lift car works?
The lift car is connected to the counterweight by suspension cables, which is shown on that diagram. It goes over the machine in the lift motor room and down to the counterweight. So when the lift moves, the counterweight moves as well.
And what are the key features of the lift car?
Lift car, the key features would be the door operator, the car walls, the car operating panel, which is the buttons, and the indicators.
Thank you. What is an auto dialer?
An auto dialer is an automatic hands-free telephone where someone is trapped in a stalled lift. They can get access to the outside. There is no handset.
What is a lift controller?
Lift controller is the brains of the lift, which connects the push buttons to the floors. So if you press a floor, the lift controller decides the quickest way to get to that floor, and also gives signals to open the lift car doors and close the lift car doors.
The lift motor room, is that the same as the lift machine room?
Yes, it would be.
Who has access to that room?
Authorised people. So I'd expect the lift maintenance engineer, the insurance inspector, and anybody who's authorised to go in that lift motor room, because it is a dangerous place to be because it has rotating equipment.
Could I ask us now to turn to a diagram which shows typical landing doors, and that can be found at RHO 0000009. And if that could be expanded slightly. Now, I think I'm right in saying this diagram comes from a guide produced by you called Lift Modernization Design Guide, the second edition. Is that understanding correct?
That is correct.
Now, the bottom picture is captioned local authority building. Apologies, the bottom of the typescript is being cut. It shows typical landing doors, is that right?
That is typical, yes.
Asking the basic question first, what are landing doors?
Landing doors are a safety feature which protects the general public from falling into the lift shaft. They are connected to the lift car, so that when the car doors open, the landing doors open at the same time.
Now, if the bottom diagram could be expanded, could you explain for the panel the various relevant components of a typical landing door? And if you could start clockwise with the alarm bell and move round.
Right, the alarm bell is connected to the lift car, so if anybody is trapped in a stalled lift, they'll ring the bell, and someone at the ground floor where there could be a caretaker will know someone is trapped in the lift car. Because on a tall building, you wouldn't be able to hear the bell if it was on top of the lift car, so that is a normal place for it to be.
So lift number is self-explanatory.
Yes.
Emergency door release, the clue is in the title, I suspect, but could you just give a basic summary?
This is a door release which authorised people would have the key to, so they can gain access to the lift car roof, access to the lift pit, and that is it really.
Vision panel is self-explanatory. Similarly, combined push and floor indicators. Moving around clockwise, the car push button, equally self-explanatory. The car ventilation grills and the car light. Again, they are what they indicate, presumably.
That's it, correct.
Any further explanation you'd like to provide to the panel?
Not that I can aware of.
Thank you. How does a manual fire control switch work?
A manual fire control switch works. They're usually at the fire service access level, and the fireman would come along with his authorised key, open either the door, break a glass, or insert the key, and twist the key, turn the key, so it engages the fire control circuits.
Thank you. And where would the fire control switch usually be found?
It's usually found at the ground floor, or where the fire service access level would be.
We've heard in evidence over the past week or so reference to a drop key. Can you help us? What are the different types of drop key?
The drop key was a key developed by the Express Lift Company, I believe for local authority use. It was supposed to be secure and was used extensively on local authority lifts. The most common key for emergency release now is what is classified as a Euro key, which is used throughout Europe, and there are tens of thousands of lifts with the Euro key, and they are to a specific dimension.
And are they the ones that are triangular?
They are, yes.
Is the drop key used the same for the fire control switch? Is that the same one that you described earlier, which is used to open the landing doors?
It would be, yes.
Finally, what is the automatic fire recall system and how does it work?
The automatic fire control system is a building safety device which when the fire is detected or heat is detected, the lifts automatically return to the ground floor and are isolated until the fire alarm detector has been reset.
Thank you. Now, could we turn on to a separate topic, which is the relevant standards? And the first part of your instructions invited you to consider the relevant legislation, regulation and guidance for fire lifts and firefighting lifts in the 1970s, so the time of original design and construction of the tower, 2005, the first post-construction lift works, and 2012-2016, the time of the second lift works, otherwise known as Project 2. Now, in your instructions and in your report, you refer to those generically as the relevant standards. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, so that people can orientate themselves in your report, legislation and standards are dealt with in Section E of your principal report, and that can be found at RHO 000 000 3 1.1.1/45. We don't need to go to them yet, but if we can just explain by way of background. First of all, in Section E, you refer to British standards. What are British standards?
British standards are national standards published by the British Standards Institution, and they are good practice.
That brings me on to my next question. Are they exemplars of good practice, or are they provide mandatory rules that must be complied with?
They are good practice.
In Section E, you also refer to European norms or codes. What is the difference between European norms on the one hand and British standards on the other?
Basically, the British standard is a European version of the European norm. There's very little difference in them.
Do the European norms reflect good practice, or by contrast, do they contain sets of rules that must be complied with?
They are mandatory.
In your report, you also refer to guidance from the Lift and Escalator Industry Association, LEA, to whom some of the witnesses have referred over the past week. What is LEA?
LEA is the Lift and Escalator Industry Association.
Is that the authoritative trade body?
It is, yes.
You refer to guidance documents published by LEA. What is the status of those documents in your view?
It's industry good practice.
And just for the avoidance of doubt, am I right in understanding that analysis of the building regulations is outside the scope of your expertise?
That is correct.
Now, if we can turn to the first element of your instructions, which is the relevant standards at the time of construction of the tower, and if we could turn to RHO 00003/46. And in terms of British standards, you first identify BS 2655/1, 1970, I should say, Specification for Lifts, Escalators, Passenger Conveyors and Paternosters, Part 1, General Requirements for Electric, Hydraulic and Hand-Powered Lifts. That standard set out the definition of a fireman's lift, is that right?
That's correct.
And it was published, as its title suggests, in February 1970?
Correct.
Before we go into this, can you describe for us the basic elements of a fireman's lift?
Basically, a fireman's lift is a normal lift with just a fire recall switch at the ground floor.
And in that context, in the context of a fireman's lift, what is the fire control switch?
It's what we'd classify in the previous part as the fireman's switch. It's a switch which will, when you turn the key, it'll bring the lift down and it's under the fireman's control.
Thank you. Now, also in your report, you explain the requirements of CP3 1971, and the reference for that standard is at BSI 0001729. We don't need to go to it. But in your report, you explain that you agree with Dr. Lane that CP3 was likely the basis for the design of Grenfell Tower. Is that right?
I believe it is, yes.
And is it right to say that the requirements of CP3, insofar as they concern lifts, are substantially the same as those found in BS 26551 1970?
That is my understanding, yes.
Now, can we go back to a diagram prepared by Dr. Lane for her presentation at Phase 1, which can be found at BLA, so that's Bravo Lima Alpha, 0005481/115. I'll just give you a brief opportunity to familiarise yourself again with that diagram. But the question is this, does that accurately summarise, in your view, the requirements and components of a fire lift?
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Now, if I could go back to the relevant standards at the time of Project 1, so this is 2003 through to 5, which are considered in Section E for Echo 2 of your report. And this can be found at RHO 00003/50. And I'd like to focus in particular on the British standards that you set out in that part of your report at Section E point 2.3, which can be found at page 59. Now, you set out at paragraphs 45 and 46, which precede this, that it is outside the scope of your expertise to comment on approved document B and its requirements. But there you note the evidence of Dr. Lane at phase 1, that in 2005 ADB stated that firefighting lift installations should be constructed and installed in accordance with the recommendations of Section 3 of British Standard 55885 1991. Is that a fair summary of your position?
It is, yes.
Now, if I can turn to discuss with you in more detail BS 55885 1991, and if I could ask for these purposes to turn to page 60 of your report. And we can see there in the bottom third of the page, this standard has a somewhat clumsy title of Fire Precautions in the Design, Construction and Use of Buildings, Part 5, Code of Practice for Firefighting, Stairs and Lifts, and it was published in August of 1991. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, at this juncture, I'd like to concentrate on what that standard says about the definition and requirements of a firefighting lift. We'll come back later to the circumstances in which a firefighting lift should be provided. But if we could turn to that standard, which is at BSI 0001721/7. Now, if we can go to paragraph 2.10, it's on the midway down the right-hand column, and it's something we've looked at frequently during the course of the past week. That is the definition of a firefighting lift, is that right?
That is correct.
And what it provides is this, that a firefighting lift is a lift designated to have additional protection with controls that enable it to be used under the direct control of the fire service in the event of fire. And under the capitalised note, the firefighting lift is a development of the type of lift known as a fireman's lift. Although existing fireman's lift installations may be replaced, fireman's lifts should not be used in new installations. Only lifts complying with this code of practice can be designated firefighting lifts. Now, for our purposes, and in particular Project 1, is that the relevant definition of a firefighting lift?
It is.
Now, if we could go to page 12 in this standard, and section 2 concerns planning and construction, and first of all deals with firefighting shafts. First of all, can you explain what is a firefighting shaft?
A firefighting shaft is a protected area which contains the firefighting lift, which will be in the firefighting well, lift well.
And that's the relevance of a firefighting shaft to a firefighting lift?
It is, yes.
Now, if we can go to page 26 within this standard, and section 3. That concerns, as you can see from the title, firefighting lift installation, and the key features are set out there. If we can look at the bottom left-hand corner of this page, paragraph 11 deals with firefighting lift cars. Can you help us? What are the principal requirements of in relation to a lift car?
The lift car shall be of a minimum size to allow the firefighters to get in and use their equipment. It shall have power operated doors, and it should have an emergency trapdoor for releasing trapped firefighters.
Thank you. Can we turn over the page to page 27 and paragraph 12? That concerns firefighting lift wells. What are the key requirements of this standard in relation to lift wells?
They've got to be strong enough to run the lift. They've got to have fire protection, so the lift can work during fire conditions. So it can run with heat, water, soots, temperatures.
And staying on this page, but looking at the bottom right-hand corner, we can see that paragraph 13 is concerned with the various requirements to protect the lift machine room. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it's to essentially it incorporates it within the firefighting shaft.
That's correct.
And if we turn over the 2 pages rather to page 29, hopefully we come to paragraph 14, which is firefighting lift control systems. Again, can you help us understand how is a firefighting lift control system intended to operate?
The control system is intended to operate when the firefighters come to the building. They need control of the lift without anybody, the general public, using it. So they insert their key into the firefighting switch, which will then bring the lift car down safely to the fire service access level where the firefighters are.
And what are the principal requirements in relation to that system imposed under the code?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, of course. What are the principal requirements of a firefighting lift control system?
It has to be, it cannot be interfered with by other people in the building. So the landing control systems, landing buttons on the landings are not operated. The firemen have complete access to the lift. They can go anywhere in the building on that lift with safety.
Thank you. Can we now go to page 32 and to paragraph 15? You see that concerns fire service communication system. Essentially that provides for an intercom system. Is that a blunt but fair summary?
That is correct.
And if we can go to page 33, we see that section 4 of the standard concerns electrical services, and paragraph 16 in particular concerns the requirement for a secondary power supply. In short, why is a secondary power supply required?
During a fire, there is a possibility that the primary electrical supply could fail, which you don't want. So the secondary power supply is a backup for supply for the firefighters, so they can fight the fire with ease without worrying if there is a fault which is going to affect the power supply.
Thank you. And if we could turn finally to page 35 and section 5. The standard here deals with routine inspection and maintenance. Again, can you summarise for the panel the essential requirements under section 5?
The requirement is that daily the operation should be released any doors by automatic release mechanism, which is not worried about the lifts. The firefighting switch weekly should be operational. Monthly, the simulation of a power supply. 6 monthly of the fire mains, and annually operational tests of the firefighting lifts. So there is a guarantee that the lift switch system has worked.
Thank you. Now, if I can now turn to the second relevant standard, which is BS EN 81-72/2003. Now, the 1991 standard was followed and I think superseded by European norm BS EN 81-72/2003. Is that right?
That's correct.
And again, this has the equally clumsy title of Safety Rules for the Construction and Installation of Lifts, Particular Applications for Passenger and Goods Passenger Lifts, Firefighters Lifts. Is that right?
That is correct.
And that was published in July 2003. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, could we go to that standard, which is at BSI quadruple 01725/8. And if we look really in the bottom third of the page at paragraph 3.5, we find here a definition of a firefighter lift. Is that right?
That is correct.
And it's defined as, and I quote, a lift installed primarily intended for passengers' use, which has additional protection, controls and signals which enable it to be used under the direct control of the fire service. To the lay eye, it's slightly different, but is it essentially identical to that in the 1991 standard?
Essentially the same.
Thank you. Unlike BS 55885/91, this standard sets out at clause 5.1 the environmental building requirements. Is that right?
That is correct.
And if we can go to page 10, we see those requirements set out there. Now, in respect of clause 5.2, we see fundamental firefighters' lift requirements are listed. We can see them set out there. firefighters' lift shall serve every floor of the building, size, etc. Can you give us a brief explanation of the fundamental requirements of a firefighting lift under this standard?
The fundamentals are there is a minimum size, which is 1100 wide by 1400 deep, with a rated load of 630 kilos. The clear entrance width shall be 800 millimetres, and the main one is the firefighter lift shall reach the furthest floor within 60 seconds.
And if we turn over the page to 5.3, we see that there are also water protection requirements set out there. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we then look at 5.4, that concerns the requirement for a trapdoor, which has been the subject of some discussion over the past week. Again, can you help us understand why is there a requirement for a trapdoor?
The trapdoor is essentially to release a trapped firefighter who, in the course of fighting the fire, for many reasons, may get trapped in the lift. So the idea is for the firefighter to be able to escape from a trapped lift.
Now, if we can turn over the page to page 12 and look at clause 5.7, we see that concerns the fire protection of the lift machine compartment and associated equipment. Is that right?
That's correct.
Next below that, clause 0.58, it's the requirement of the firefighting lift control systems. They're set out there. Again, can you give us a layman's summary of the essence of those requirements?
The requirements are so the firefighters have a standardisation of when they go into a building, they know where the fire service access level will be and where the switch will be.
Thank you. If we can go to page 15 now and clause 5.9. That is the requirement for primary and secondary power supplies. And again, you've explained that and their purpose. And if we stay on this page but go down to the bottom to clause 5.12, we see there the requirement for a fire service communication system. Can you help us briefly? What's the purpose of that system?
The system is to allow the firefighters to communicate with two-way speech to their operatives inside the lifts.
Thank you. Is it right to say that there are no express requirements as to maintenance in this standard?
There is no. That's correct.
Can I turn to the third and final standard that I'd like to discuss with you in relation to Project 1, and that's BS 5588-5, 2004, which is entitled Fire Precautions in the Design, Construction and Use of Buildings, Access and Facilities for Firefighting. Was that published in November 2014?
It was.
And it replaced the 1991 version of the standard, is that right?
That's correct.
And it incorporated BS EN 8172-2003.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Now, can you just help me? I'm curious, looking at what's on the screen at the moment. I see in the last line, when the standard is dealing with vandal-prone areas, there's a reference to a European norm which is prefixed by the letters PR. What does that indicate?
It means it's out for discussion.
It's provisional, is it?
Provisional, yes.
Ah, yes, thank you very much.
It hasn't got any standing in a mandatory law.
Right. Thank you.
Now, looking at the 2004 standard, if we can go to BSI quadruple 1723/6 and clause 3.12. And here we have the third iteration of a definition of a firefighting lift. To the lay eye, it seems broadly the same as its two predecessors. Is that a fair comment to make?
That is a fair comment to make.
And it defined firefighting lift as one with fire protection measures, including controls that enable it to be used under the direct control of the fire service in fighting a fire. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, if we can turn within this standard but to page 27 and look at clause 7.2.4. And we see there in the second paragraph under the subheading this, and I quote, firefighting lift installations should conform to BS EN 8172 and to BS EN 81-1 or BS EN 81-2 as appropriate for the particular type of lift. Stopping there, can you briefly explain to us the relevance and significance of BS EN 81-1 and 81-2?
BSEN 81-1 relates to lifts which are classified as traction lifts, and BSEN 81-2 relates to lifts which are hydraulic.
Thank you. And if we can now go to stay on page 27 and look at clause 7.2.7. Actually, we may have to go over the page. Thank you. Now, this section concerns firefighting lift cars, as we can see from the subtitle, and the key requirement seems to be that set out in the first sentence, which is that the construction design of firefighting lift cars, together with the installation of firefighting lifts, should conform to BS EN 81-72. It also notes that firefighting lifts should be conspicuously marked. Is that a fair summary of the relevant aspects of that requirement?
That is a fair assessment.
Can we now go to page 31 and clause 7.2.8, which we're on, thank you. This concerns water protection, and in essence it provides that, as required by BSEN 81-72/2003, water protection should be provided. Is that a fair summary of what we need to know from this section?
That is a fair summary.
Staying on page 31, can we look at clause 7.2.9, which concerns lift machinery spaces? It also refers to BSEN 81-72/2003. Is there anything that you need to highlight to the panel arising from this standard?
What this is highlighting is that the standard doesn't want hot gases and smoke entering the lift shaft and going into the lift motor room, which will affect the lift controllers.
Thank you. Can we turn over to page 32 in clause 8? And this concerns firefighting lift control systems. Can you broadly explain to us or summarise the requirements of this particular element of the standard?
This is trying to codify, so there's a standard around Europe of how the lift control system shall work on a firefighting control system. So it goes down to basic details. So every lift that goes into Europe or under the EN 81, in the EN code, will have the same fire control system.
Thank you. And if we could turn over the page to page 33 in clause 8.3. You can see that 8.3 concerns changeover from primary to secondary supply after the operation of the firefighting lift switch, and that too refers to BSEN 81-72/2003. Anything further to be highlighted from that section?
The only thing I would highlight is when you change over from a primary to secondary power supply, there is a delay of up to 30 seconds while the secondary power is established. It's not direct straight away. The emergency lighting will come on in the car because you lost the power, but it won't be an automatic seamless changeover.
Thank you. And if we could turn now to page 41 and clause 14.1. Again, we see specific provision for primary and secondary power supplies. Can you summarise for us the key requirements of this element of the standard?
The key elements are that the primary and secondary power supply should be protected against water, fire and water damage.
Thank you. Again, is it correct that this standard does not contain a section on maintenance?
That's correct.
Do you know why?
I have got no idea why.
Would you expect the person with responsibility for maintenance to follow the recommendations set out in the 1991 code, absent anything else?
I would expect that as a best practice, yes.
Could we go back to another diagram from Dr. Lane's Phase 1 report, and that can be found at BLA quadruple 5481/92. I'll just give you a brief opportunity to refresh your memory of that. Is that a useful, indeed accurate, diagrammatic summary of the requirements of a firefighting lift?
That's a very good summary of a firefighting lift.
Could we go to BLA quadruple 5481/116? Now here, this is a diagrammatic summary of the differences between a fire lift and a firefighting lift. First of all, is a fire lift just an abbreviated, another way of referring to a fireman's lift?
No, it's not.
What's the difference?
The fire lift has got no added features. It's not helping. It doesn't help the firefighters fight a fire.
And does this set out accurately the principal differences between a fire lift and the firefighting lift, in your view?
I believe it does.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry, can we just clarify the previous question, your answer to the previous question? We've seen references to fireman's lift and fire lift. Are those two things the same?
It depends who you talk to. They are the same. I would say a fire lift and a fireman's lift are the same.
That's what I had understood.
Yes.
And they're both distinct from a firefighting
Fighting lift, yes.
And a firefighting lift is called that because it's designed to be used by firemen in the course of fighting a fire. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much.
I think there is some people use the terminology incorrectly. Fire and fireman's lifts are being used quite a lot.
Yes. Well, I think we've now clarified.
I think we have clarified that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir. Can we now turn to relevant standards at the time of Project 2? That's the works in 2015 or thereabouts. And if we could go back to your main report, which is RHO quadruple 00003/82 and paragraph 99. Now you note there that consideration of the requirements of approved document B is outside the scope of your expertise, but you note Dr. Lane's Phase 1 report, which notes that ADB 2013 referred to BS EN 81-72 2003 and BS 5588-5 2004, the standards which we've just been discussing. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary, yes.
By the time of Project 2, so 2015, did the features of a firefighting lift which we've been considering still apply, or had they materially changed?
They still applied.
There was an update to BS EN 8172 2003, which was published in April 2015. That was called BS EN 8172 2015. Given the timing of the lift works, is it reasonable to expect that those involved with Project 2 were to have applied the changes in the 2015 standard?
In my opinion, no.
And why?
The works on Project 2 was of a limited significance.
Thank you. And am I right in understanding that the 2015 version of BSEN 8172 in Annex J repeated the recommendation set out in the 1991 standard that the fire control switch should be typically checked weekly?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to a separate topic which emerged in the sort of evidence relatively recently? And you recall that Stephen Ellis from Butler & Young provided a second statement, which can be found at BUT quadruple 0005554. If we go to that briefly in paragraph 7. What he says there is, in my experience, there were always budgetary considerations.
Should we just get it up and we can follow it?
Yeah,
Yes, thank you.
In my experience, there were always budgetary considerations when local authority refurbishments were being considered, which, of course, had an influence on the scheme eventually selected. And if we go to paragraph 15, which is over the page on page 5, sorry, paragraph 13 over the page on page 5, he says this: in my view, to achieve compliance with BS 55885 would have added considerable cost and delay to the project, even if all elements were feasible. And Mr. Morehouse comments in similar terms. We don't need to go to his statement, but for reference, it's paragraph 27, which can be found at BUT *00054/9. Now, bearing in mind the views of Mr. Ellis and Mr. Morehouse, do British standards or indeed any other guidance documents set out in your reports distinguish between lift fire safety and compliance in local authority as opposed to privately owned residential buildings?
No, they don't.
Does a lower standard of good industry practice apply to local authority housing compared to privately owned housing?
No, it doesn't.
In your understanding experience, should the same standards apply to all types of high-rise residential building, regardless of ownership?
Yes, they should.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to the original lift installation? Now, you explained earlier that you agreed with Dr. Lane's view that CP3 was likely to have been the basis for the design of Grenfell Tower, and therefore Grenfell Tower should have had a fireman's lift installation when it was built. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary, yes.
Now, you go on to say in your report, and the reference is RHO 000300385, that there is limited, indeed very limited, information about the original lift installation. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so you weren't able to draw any conclusions about whether the original lift installation complied with the relevant standards. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary.
But you can say that a fireman's control switch was installed.
Yes.
Again, hopefully this is a fair way of summarising your view, but it appears that a fireman's lift was installed originally at the tower, but ultimately there is so little evidence that you cannot give the inquiry an informed view as to the compliance with the original lifts with contemporaneous standards.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, the next section of your report, which I'd like to ask you questions about, is the requirement for a firefighting lift. And that was set out at section H of your main report. And that starts at RHO 00003/104. Now, this deals with the particular question of whether the requirement for firefighting lifts applied to only new lifts or whether it also applied to so-called modernised lifts. And you consider whether, at the time of Project 1, the lifts should have been upgraded to firefighting lifts. Is that a useful summary of the focus of this section of your report?
That's a useful focus.
Thank you. Cutting to the chase, what is your view? Should the lifts have been upgraded to a firefighting lift as part of Project 1?
Yes, they should have.
Now, I'd like to explore the reasons for you coming to that conclusion. And first of all, I'd like to look at the standards as they apply to new buildings. Now, if Grenfell Tower had been built in 2005, i.e. it was a new building, would it have been designed with a firefighting lift?
Yes, it would have.
Now, one phrase which has cropped up during evidence over the past week is that of reasonable practicability. Now, what is your understanding of the meaning of that phrase?
It means, in my opinion, that was it practically
Is it a balance between the seriousness of risk on one hand and the difficulty and cost of eliminating or mitigating the risk on the other?
In my opinion, the difficulty, the cost shouldn't come into it.
Is the phrase reasonable practicability defined at all in the relevant standards?
No, it's not.
Now, as discussed, there is a range of different features which make up a firefighting lift. Can you separate out those features from each, i.e. only install some but not all, and yet still classified properly as a firefighting lift?
I think the lift has to comply fully or not at all.
Now, can we look at the rules insofar as they apply to modernised lifts? And at the time of Project 1, was there any standard or guidance which stated expressly whether existing lifts should be modernised up to modern firefighting lift standard?
In my opinion, there wasn't at that time.
Now, if we can look at BS 5655-11, 1989, and you refer to that at paragraph 207 of your report, and if we can go to RHO 00003/109, now you'll see at paragraph 208, roughly midway down that page, you note that BS 5655-11 does not concern firefighting lift features, but then you go on to say at paragraph 209 this. Section 2.4.1 of the standard states that, I quote, where the controller of a fireman's lift as defined in BS 5655 Part 6 is changed, the control system should comply with BS 5588 Part 5. This does not, however, imply compliance with all other requirements in that standard for a firefighting lift, especially with regard to the structural enclosure. Can you help us? What is the significance of that passage?
In my opinion, the significance of that passage is that the control system for the firefighting lift has got to comply with 5588 Part 5. It's an upgrade, but it doesn't have to comply with or implicate the other parts of the standard, especially the structure.
Confining ourselves only to the standards at this stage and not what else might have been said by TMO or anyone else, at the time of Project 1, should Butler and Young have considered whether the existing firemen's lifts at the tower could be modernised to meet modern firefighting lift standards?
In my opinion, yes.
So even if the lift works were characterised as a lift modernisation and not the installation of new lifts, do you think the lifts should have been upgraded to firefighting lifts subject to the proviso of reasonable practicability?
I do.
Can you explain why you add the qualification only insofar as it is reasonably practicable? Why wasn't compliance with all requirements of the standard necessary or practicable?
Well, we didn't know, I don't know at that time what the structural constraints of the building were.
Thank you. Now, in his second witness statement, Mr. Morehouse of Butler and Young states at paragraph 8, which can be found, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is BUT:000054/4. He says this: modernisations were generally expected to incorporate not only the current lift standards, but also the standards laid down by that local authority. What's your assessment of that statement?
My assessment of that statement is that the overriding standard is the British standard. The local authority standard is not recognised.
And have you ever come across an organisation such as a local authority, for example, having its own lift standards which are separate and distinct to British or European standards?
No.
Where a European or British standard set a higher standard than that imposed under a local authority bespoke one, which standard would take precedence?
The European standard.
Thank you.
Well, can we just explore that a little bit? If the local authority had some standards of its own, they would be likely to become part of the contract with the lift refurbishment company, wouldn't they?
They would.
And are you aware of anything which prevents a local authority from requiring compliance with its own standards?
I think we're getting confused slightly. Is the local authority standard may have a specification,
Yes.
and the specification will refer to standards.
Yes.
And there is on a new lift you can get a derogation from BSI if there is a part of equipment that doesn't comply with the standard.
Yes, but I mean, unless there is legislation which makes certain equipment or standards mandatory, it's a case of the customer calling the shots, isn't it?
I wouldn't say so. I'd say that the standard for the lifts are a safety standard, and they should bear the overriding standard.
Well, I see the force of that observation, but if the customer says, I don't want that,
If the customer says it doesn't want it, I would expect a professional organisation to have that in writing to say why they don't want it and justification, and also probably get an insurance evaluation why they're not accepting that rule.
right. I mean, I raised the question, I mean, maybe we're going to come back to this, I'm not sure, but the escape hatch has been the subject of a certain amount of evidence.
Yes.
And, well, maybe we're coming to that, are we, Mr. Kinnear?
We may touch on it.
Right. Well, perhaps I'll not trespass on Mr. Kinnear's line of questioning just yet. All right. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, sir. We are going to move on to a new topic now, and that's the concept of new lifts. And the key standard which you refer to in your report dealing with this question is BS 5655-11, 2005, Lifts and Service Lifts, Code of Practice for the Undertaking of Modifications to Existing Electric Lifts. And if we can turn to it, which is at BSI 0001724, and page 7 in particular. And in your report, you noted section 1, scope, which says in the second paragraph that part of BS 5655 does not cover any of the following types of lift. A, new lifts, and a reference is made to Note 2. Note 2 is immediately below and says this: where a lift falls into one of the following categories, it is deemed to be a new lift as defined in the Lifts Regulations 1997, and this part of BS 5655 is not applicable. And the other items where this does not, this part of the section does not apply, is where the lift is completely replaced and only retains the guide rails. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, can you explain what this standard Note 2 in particular tells us about the definition of a new lift?
The new lift is, in my opinion, a lift in a lift shaft, a lift well, which is totally new. All new equipment, 100% new equipment.
And so a new lift is a new lift if it's on one, either completely replaced,
Yes,
or if only the guide rails are retained and everything else is replaced.
that's correct.
That's a bit crude, but is it enough for present purposes?
For present purpose, that's correct.
Now, in your report, you go on to investigate the extent of what was and what wasn't replaced during the course of Project 1. And if we go to your report, which is at RHO 0000003/112 and paragraph 226. And there we go. And you start by considering the Butler and Young specification, which is set out there, which identifies the retained equipment, which we've looked at in evidence over the past few days. If we could go to BUT 0000044/12, which is just the home document which is quoted there, it indicates that only the guides, a single riser of car guide brackets, and the landing back boxes were retained. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, the chairman asked the witnesses a number of questions about these items. What's the significance, first of all, of the retention of guides and single riser of car guide brackets?
The intention, I think, was to use the existing car size without destroying or removing the car guide brackets or relocating them.
And the landing back boxes, first of all, what are those boxes?
The landing back boxes are the boxes where the push button, the landing push button, is fitted to.
This may well be too crude a question, but how important are landing back boxes in terms of the apparatus of a lift?
They're not very important at all.
Now, you say in your report, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is paragraph 236, which is at page 116 of your report, that the guides would have had to have been relocated. Why do you say that?
because the car size was increased, and by increasing the car size, you had to renew the guide brackets and replace the guides.
And indeed, I think I'm right in saying that the evidence of the Butler and Young and Apex witnesses was that the guide rails were in fact relocated as you anticipated.
Yes.
Now, at paragraph 242 of your report, again, we don't need to go to it, but it's at page 117, you list all the equipment which was replaced or likely to have been replaced, and that included the complete lift car, the counterweight, the car sling and platform, safety gear, door operator, car doors, landing control system, lift pit buffers, electrical wiring, lift controller, and the lift motor gearbox. Given that all those parts were replaced, the guides were relocated. In your view, were the lifts likely to be new lifts or not?
In my opinion, it should have been a new lift.
And if they were new lifts, does it follow that they ought to have been firefighting lifts?
Correct.
Would the qualification or the proviso of reasonable practicability have applied in those circumstances?
The only thing that would be in reasonable practical would be the structural integrity.
If I can just draw the strands of this.
Sorry, before we leave that, it would require, presumably, quite a lot of additional equipment or structure, wouldn't it? Because if I've understood what I've heard so far reasonably correctly, you would need to make provision for water protection and for the removal of water from this pit.
Yes.
Is that right?
Correct.
And that would have required either some form of pumping or drainage or whatever.
Correct.
And you would have had to provide a secondary power supply.
Correct.
Either from a generator or from a separate substation. Is that the case?
That's correct, yes.
So that would have required quite considerable new electrical installation.
Yes.
And that's apart from the famous escape hatch in the roof of the car, which was not a big item.
No.
But
And
seems to be a contentious one.
Sorry. And the protection of equipment is a minor part. It'd be just some covers over the electrical equipment from stop dripping water coming down.
Yes.
So the protection of water in the lift shaft is a minor item.
Well, the protection aspect I can see
Yes.
as a minor item. The removal aspect might or might not be. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And is it your view that all that additional equipment should have been provided?
I think someone should have gone through the costing analysis, see if it was reasonably practical.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because in your view, might there come a point at which the cost of providing that additional equipment was too great to make it justifiable?
I can't answer that question because I don't know what the budget was.
No, you can't answer the question in relation to this lift,
Yeah.
but in principle, is it your view that there might come a point at which the cost would be prohibitive?
There could be somewhere down the line, yes.
And how does that fit with the requirement of the guides that they should be treated as a new lift with all this extra equipment?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Sorry, sir.
Well, the guidance which we've been looking at
Yes.
suggests that because only the guide rails were retained and the back boxes,
Yes.
it should be regarded as a new lift and therefore should be a firefighting lift. But I think what you're now telling us is that there might be a point at which that wouldn't really be economically sensible.
Hypothetically, yes.
So you just disregard that bit of the guidance, I take it, at that point.
Well, if it was a new lift, you could go to the notified body, because a new lift has to get a CE mark and get a derogation from that part of the code.
Right.
There is a possibility that could happen.
All right.
But safety is the number one part of the code. Cost doesn't come into the code.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. That's helpful. Yes, Mr.
So you've stolen my thunder.
Oh, sorry.
Again, but I think it's your prerogative, though, sir. Mr. Howkins, just drawing out one point there, arising from your answers to the chairman's questioning. Cost does play a role in assessment of reasonable practicability, it would appear. Would you accept that?
I would, yes.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to the separate topic of Butler & Young's involvement in Project One? Now, they were only involved in Project One, and if we can go to TMO 00853-783/2, hopefully we come to the project brief. And am I right in thinking this was produced by the TMO for the lift consultants who were Butler & Young?
I believe it was.
And as we see there, it's dated August 2002. And if we could stay in this document, but go to page 15, and in particular paragraph 4.10. You'll see there headed standards. And if I could ask you to refresh your memory of little c.
Yes, I've refreshed it.
Is it your view that the TMO asked Butler & Young to consider the issue of firefighting lift requirements based on what is said there?
It is.
Now, Stephen Ellis from Butler & Young described in his statement, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is BUT *0004040/1, described Butler & Young's first duty as, quotes, discussion of the scope of the proposed works. In your view, what should this discussion have included, given what is required there in clause 4.10?
The discussion should have should have at least highlighted the compliance with the N81-1, the lift regulations, and the firefighting requirements and evacuation requirements. At least they should have highlighted it and discussed it and minuted it.
Now, on that point, after you'd produced both of your reports, Mr. Morehouse from Butler & Young produced a second statement. And in that second statement, and the reference is BUT *00054/7, and if we go to that, so that's BUT *00054/7. And looking at paragraphs 21 and 22, I paraphrase, but in those paragraphs there, he says that on the 8th of May 2003, he had an unminuted meeting with John Rogers and David Steppel being the principal lift engineer at the TMO. And he says this, I do recall at this meeting that I did raise the issue of firefighting lifts. However, I was instructed by David Steppel and John Rogers to proceed on the basis that firemen's lifts were required, consistent with Section 10 of Appendix A, and that consideration of firefighting lifts was not to be part of the feasibility study, and no reference was required in the study. I do not recollect marking a note of this instruction or confirming it in writing to KCTMO. However, as the approved contents of the feasibility study shows, this was the basis upon which I proceeded. In your view, was this verbal instruction from the TMO consistent with its written instruction in the client brief, in particular little c at clause 4.10?
I was expected, after that discussion, to have a written instruction from TMO.
Now, if we can go to RHO quadruple...
Sorry to interrupt you again, Mr. Kinnear. Before we leave this, I noticed on the previous on the previous document, which I think was the brief, a reference to firefighting and evacuation lifts. Is there a distinction between them?
There's a slight difference, yes. The evacuation has more communications. Right. It's a separate control system to evacuate people that may have got injured, may.
Right. So there's otherwise it's in the same physical structure. Is it?
Oh yes, definitely.
Right. Thank you very much. Yes. Sorry.
Thanks, sir. If we can go, just following on the instruction that Mr. Morehouse referred to, coming from Mr. Steppel and Mr. Rogers in May 2003, could we go to RHO quadruple 0 003 142. And if we could look at paragraph 326.2 of your report, your conclusion in relation to Butler and Young was that, and I quote, the Butler and Young April 2004 specification was deficient in a number of respects. Overall, it did not specify the features of a firefighting lift, which it should have done, unless it was not reasonably practicable to incorporate such features. I have seen no witness evidence or documents which suggest that any such deliberation or discussion took place. Now, given the evidence of Mr. Ellis and Mr. Morehouse last week, namely that the TMO expressly instructed Butler and Young not to consider firefighting lifts, if that happened, would that alter the opinion that is set out in paragraph 326.2?
No, I don't think she would.
So your view remains that even if the TMO had instructed Butler and Young expressly not to install a firefighting lift, that does not alter your opinion as to their conduct in this matter?
No, it doesn't.
And can you help us understand why?
I think the safety of the firefighters and the safety standard takes precedent from a client's instruction. It's a safety feature. It's to help firefighters fight a fire in a high-rise building.
Would you have expected Mr. Morehouse to have made some form of record of the express instruction from the TMO, as it had conflicted with what appears to be the project brief requirements?
I would have expected that, yes.
Would you have expected the feasibility study to reflect or record the instruction as well?
I would have expected that, yes.
And that's because it was inconsistent with the apparent intent and requirements of the project brief?
I would have expected that even if it was just a file note in a project notebook.
Thank you. Could we now consider the feasibility study that was prepared by Butler and Young? And that report can be found at BUT:000002 and was prepared in July 2003 by Butler and Young. The key issue here is, did the report address the issue of firefighting lift requirements? My question to you is, did it?
I don't think it did.
Should it have done?
It should have done, yes.
And for the reasons you've just given?
Yeah, correct.
And just for the avoidance of doubt, does the evidence of Mr. Morehouse and indeed Mr. Ellis that there was an express instruction not to consider firefighting lifts, does that alter or modify your opinion in any way?
No, it doesn't.
Now, I'm about to turn to a new topic, sir. I don't know, and it's spot on 11:15.
Well, that might be a convenient point, mightn't it, Mr. Kinnear?
It would. Thank you, sir.
Yes. Well, Mr. Howkins, we have a short break during the morning, and this seems like a good time to take it. So we'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 11:30.
Okay.
And I must ask you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room.
Okay.
And, if you go with the usher now, we'll see you again in 1/4 hour.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Kinnear. 11:30.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Would you ask Mr. Howkins to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Howkins, ready to carry on?
I'm ready, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Howkins, just before we go on to some further evidence of the Butler and Young witnesses, could I ask you to turn to RHO 00003/122 and paragraph 262. And this is where you're discussing the feasibility study, and you say, overall, I would have expected to see in the report an option of bringing the lifts up to full firefighting standard alongside other options and the benefits, disadvantages of each, including considerations such as cost, length of programme of works, and need to decant residents, etc. And if we turn over the page to paragraph 263, I would have expected Butler and Young to advise us the best option, but ultimately the final decision would have been for TMO. Does that remain your view?
It still remains my view, yes.
And so if TMO had said, don't install firefighting lifts, ultimately Butler and Young could do no more.
That's correct.
Now, can I turn to further evidence of the Butler and Young witnesses? And the Mr. Ellis at paragraph capital A 12.a of his witness statement, and that can be found at BUT 0004040/4, said that Butler and Young, so I'll just let that come up, there we go, A12A, roughly just above halfway point on that page, said Butler and Young did not consider the two refurbished lifts as new lifts. Significant equipment was retained. Mr. Morehouse says something similar. We don't need to go to it, but the reference is at BUT 00023/5. If we can go to the second statement of Mr. Ellis, which is at BUT 00055/5, and paragraph 14, which is just below halfway. They said, Butler and Young considered that the two passenger lifts at Grenfell Tower comprised a refurbishment because significant equipment was retained. This retained equipment included guide rails, guide bracketry, counterweight and landing back boxes. From recollection, the term refurbishment was employed on every document throughout the project. Now, just bearing in mind, I think there was some doubt in Mr. Ellis's mind whether the counterweight was retained or not. Mr. Morehouse thought it had been replaced. With that caveat, what was your view on the evidence of Butler and Young as to whether the lifts were new or refurbished?
In my opinion, there wasn't significant equipment retained. The only retained equipment was the guide rails, but in a different location. From my opinion, the guide rail bracketry, the counterweight were renewed, and the landing boxes were retained.
Thank you. If we can go to Steve Ellis's statement, BUT 00040/4, and paragraph capital A 12.c. He says, my understanding is that it was considered at the time that due to structural and environmental constraints, complete compliance with BS 5588 would only be fully achieved by the installation of completely new lifts in new buildings. I believe these matters were discussed and agreed with KCTMO at an early stage. Mr. Morehouse expressed a similar view in his statement, and if we go to BUT 00023/6, and paragraph A 12.c, he said this, I do not recall full compliance with BS 5588 being discussed. I assume as this could only be achieved with completely new lifts and new buildings, not those existing with structural and other constraints. What's your assessment of the evidence on that particular point as given by Mr. Ellis and Mr. Morehouse?
I don't believe that full compliance means that you have to have a new lift in new buildings. And and the structural and other constraints should have been considered.
Now, bearing in mind that, can we now turn to the specification? And if we could turn to paragraph 271 of your report, which can be found at RHO 0000003/124. And then we see at paragraph 271 onwards, you deal with the specification. Can we turn to the specification itself, which is at BUT 0000044? And if we go to page 60, which is the fireman's control, what is your view as the type of switch which was provided for in the specification? It appears to require an old-style fireman's control switch as opposed to a modern fire control switch. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment, yes, it is.
Can you help us? What is the difference between a switch operable with a drop key rather than an emergency unlocking triangle?
It's exactly the same key. Oh, sorry, can we rephrase that? Yeah, the drop key was the one that's specified. The triangle is the European standard one.
Are there any advantages or disadvantages to using one type of switch compared to the other? So an old fireman's control switch as opposed to the modern fire control switch?
Are you talking about the key that operates it?
No, the type of switch itself.
There's no difference.
Thank you. You note that the documents indicate that the TMO may have explicitly specified the drop key. And if we can go to RHO 0000003/131. You discuss those matters there. My question is this. If the TMO had specified the old-fashioned, if I can put it that way, drop key as opposed to the European triangular key, what would you have expected Butler & Young to advise the TMO in those circumstances?
I'd have expected Butler & Young to advise TMO that the key that they specified wasn't compliant with the requirement for a new lift or a Euro key.
On the basis of your review of the evidence, can you say whether that advice was given or not?
I cannot say. I haven't seen any evidence to say one way or the other.
Now, in evidence, both in their statements and in oral evidence, both Mr. Ellis and Mr. Morehouse, and indeed Mr. Killarn yesterday, said that they all considered the triangular Euro key was too available and vulnerable to use by unauthorised persons. What's your assessment of that evidence?
I don't accept that. The Euro key has been used worldwide, well, European-wide, for many years. There's thousands, probably tens of thousands of lifts with that type of key, and it's a safer key because it's got specific dimensions.
And is it fair to summarise your evidence this way, that because the Euro key was the key that was specified, that's the one that should have been used?
It is, yes.
Were you aware at the...
Well, wouldn't that depend on what the client wanted? I mean, the evidence that we have is that the client did not want the Euro key for reasons good or bad, which at least it thought were good. Is that just not the fact of life then? That's what they wanted and they were entitled to have it?
I agree it's a fact of life, but I would have thought that Butler & Young would have advised that it wasn't to the European code. And the European code is, in my opinion, is a much safer key than the express drop key.
All right, thank you. Now, I think we all of us on the panel have a reasonable understanding of the drop key switch and box because you very helpfully gave us a photograph of it in your supplemental report. But I'm not sure we've seen any comparable photographs of the Euro key and box. Do you know where we might find some?
Yes, it's in one of the BS
I'll try and get the reference. I think it is in one of the
It's in BS 81, the latest version, and there's a.
Right.
I'm sure there's an appendix at the back which gives you the dimensions of it.
Well, then, in that case, well, I'd really find a picture helpful. Is there a picture in the BS document?
Yes, it's a sketch.
We'll have a look. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir. We'll try and get the reference for you. Can I now turn to the subject of trapdoors? The lifts as installed did not have a trapdoor as part of Project 1. In your view, would it have been reasonably practicable to have installed the trapdoor?
Yes, it would.
And can you give the panel the essential reasoning by which you've come to that view?
In my evidence, there's a sketch of a lift car, and it shows you, highlighted in red, where the location would be. So physically, there is a location which could be a trapdoor, could be fitted.
And the clear evidence that came from the Butler and Young, indeed Apex witnesses, was that trapdoors pose a security risk and that unauthorised persons could gain access to the lift shaft and thereby causing a danger to themselves and others. In your view, is that a significant factor mitigating against the installation of a trapdoor?
I don't think it's a significant factor.
Why not?
Because we're talking about lives of firefighters and the security of the building. You know, to get into the building, you'd have to go through an access door.
Thank you. And water protection, would it have been reasonably practical to have installed water protection measures?
It'd been really easy to put water protection measures on the lift car.
And can you just give the panel an idea of how easy it would have been so they can understand your reasoning?
It would be, in layman's terms, a tray fitted over the front of the lift car where the door operator and electrical equipment is to deflect water that may be dripping down the lift shaft.
Thank you. Would it have been reasonably practical to have installed a secondary power supply? Now, the chairman's asked you a question on this in the first session this morning. Do you have enough information upon which to come to a view on that subject?
I haven't had enough information on that.
And so you can't express a firm view either way?
My view of looking at the drawings would be there would be enough space in the lift shaft to run the cables. But I'm not sure. I'm not an electrical engineer, so I wouldn't know whether it's a generator or a secondary power supply transformer.
Would it have been reasonably practical to have installed a fire service communication system?
Yes, it would.
And can you explain to the panel why?
It's just an intercom system which goes from the fire service access level to the lift car, to the lift motor room, so the person in charge can talk to the fire brigade personnel in the lift and in the lift motor room.
Were you able to establish whether the fire resistance or what the fire resistance capacity was of the landing doors?
One of the test certificates from Apex said that it was a 2-hour fire certificate, and one said that one of the test certificates wasn't completed. So we haven't seen any evidence to say they were fire rated.
Can I now turn to the separate topic, and that's the involvement of Apex, and they were involved in both Projects 1 and 2, is that right?
That's correct.
And in relation to Project 1, they were the lift contractors, is that right?
That's correct.
Typically, what's the division of responsibility between the lift contractor and the lift consultant?
They'll be in communication with them throughout the project, from the start of the project right the way through to the end, including agreeing drawings, finishes, testing, commissioning, project management. And
who did what? Can you help the panel just have a clear understanding of that?
The lift contractor would be employed to complete the lift to the specification requirements. That would include ordering materials, delivery to site, installation of materials, testing and commissioning, and final handover, and also handing probably to the lift consultant the O&M manual.
Now, if Mr. Steppel of the TMO gave the instruction to Butler and Young that firefighting lifts were not to be installed. What duties did Apex have, so Apex have, in relation to ensuring that the specification was compliant with relevant standards? Were they entitled to assume the spec is the spec and not say anything more, or would you have expected them to have done more?
I would have expected Apex to be in contact with Butler and Young to draw out any conclusions or differences between the specification and the current codes.
Now, if we can go to your main report, which is RHO 0003152 and paragraph 361.1. If I just let you familiarise yourself with that. Now, the Apex witnesses each gave evidence that an all-or-nothing approach was adopted to upgrades to firefighting lifts. Either it had all the features of firefighting lifts or none. The justification given for this practice was that having only some firefighting features might cause confusion to firefighters when they attended to fight a fire. Does that evidence change your views as to whether it was appropriate for Apex to have highlighted the issue of upgrading to a firefighting lift to Butler and Young?
In my opinion, professionally, Apex should have informed Butler and Young in writing where the specification or lifts they were going to install didn't comply.
And looking at what you set out in paragraph 361.1, you say that Apex did not, quote, act according to good industry practice or as a reasonable lift contractor would, close quotes. Can you help the panel? What is the basis of your understanding of good industry practice on this particular point?
As Apex are a member of LEA, they will be up to date with latest codes and standards and good practice. Therefore, they've probably got more of an insight into what the codes say and required based on information they got from LEA. And I strongly believe that good industry practice at the time would be that the lift contractor would inform their client and maybe their consultant where the lifts don't comply.
Thank you. Before we move on to a separate topic, sir, I think I have the reference to diagram of the Euro key.
Oh, thank you.
And if we can go to BSI 00090/54. 51, I apologise. Is that it?
That is it, yes.
I'm not sure you're any the wiser on the basis of that.
Well, not as wise as I'd like to be. That's true for a lot of things, of course. But does this operate with a cylindrical key that you put into a circular aperture?
Yes.
And it's what I might call a straight line key, is it? You just put the key in and it engages a spindle, triangular spindle, at some way into the...
And usually the key, where the circular part is, it's spring-loaded, so you have to push it in.
Right.
So where it's got the dimension of 6.5 and 9.5, that is where there's a spring-loaded.
Right. Now, the reason we were given why it was said that local authorities don't like this particular key is that it's widely available from unauthorised sources, if I can put it like that, and therefore people can get hold of them and play around with the systems. Do you have any knowledge about that?
To my knowledge, they are available, and they're available from suppliers. But if there was a problem with safety and misuse, I would have expected British standards, European norms, to have changed their design to stop them being from being used by unauthorised people. As I said earlier, there's tens of thousands of these, in operation around Europe and the Far East.
Right. Yes, well, thank you very much.
If we can stay on the generic topic of the fire control switch, and if we go to your report, which is RHO 00003/144 and paragraph 339. Thank you. And there you say, I've seen evidence that Apex's original tender appeared to make provision for a code compliance switch. Now, that was later changed. Given that it was changed to the express drop key, would you have expected Apex to raise any concerns that the drop key was non-compliant at that stage?
If they had an instruction from their client to use it, I think they've done as much as they can do.
And if the TMO decided to proceed for
Yes.
them as client, that was their prerogative?
Yes.
Were you able to establish who the manufacturer of the fire control switch was?
No, we weren't.
Would knowing the identity of the manufacturer alter your view in any way?
No, it wouldn't.
Can I now turn to the fire alarm recall matter? And if we could stay in your report, but turn to page 146 and look at paragraphs 347 onwards. Now, there you explained that a number of emails suggest that an automatic fire recall system was installed as part of Project 1. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary.
Yeah. Can you explain generally what the automatic fire alarm recall systems do?
When the alarm detects smoke, heat, it'll send a signal to the lift controller, and the lift will return directly to the main floor and lock out, so no one can use the lifts.
And how does that differ from a fire control switch?
This one is done automatically from a fire alarm.
So the clue's in the title, automatic fire alarm.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, can we turn to Project 2? Now, Apex's responsibilities were to provide 4 new landing door assemblies over walkway +1 and mezzanine floors, and to carry out any modifications necessary to suit those new entrances. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary, yes.
Now, at that stage, did Apex have a duty to flag non-compliance of the lifts with relevant standards?
I don't believe they should have, no.
And why not?
The work was so limited.
Now, a second fire control switch was found on the walkway floor of the tower after the fire. Is it your view that that was likely to have been installed at the time of Project 2?
I think it was, but I've got no evidence to say it was. But my gut feeling is yes, it was.
And looking at the surrounding evidence set out in your
Yes.
report. Were you able to establish whether Apex had installed that switch on your review?
No, I wasn't.
Have you been able to establish whether Apex disconnected that switch?
No, we haven't.
Now, paragraph 151 of his witness statement, which can be found at IWS 0001355/51, Resident Shahid Ahmed referred to a letter he sent to Councillor Blakeman, in which he suggested that Ryden's overuse of the lifts during the refurbishment in 2016 was leading to excessive lift breakdowns. Is it possible, in your view, that heavy use of the lifts before the night of the fire could have affected their operability?
No.
Can you help us as to why you've reached that view?
I think from the documents I've seen, the lift was being used for moving small pieces of equipment up and down the Project 2. And there may have been dirt. There would have been builders' work dirt in the area and in the door track, so it could have reliability problems, but they'll only be temporary.
Can I now turn to the TMO's policy on fire lifts and firefighting lifts? And if we could go back to sections L2 and L1 of your report, which can be found at RHO 00003/164, and in particular the definition employed by the TMO of firefighting lifts and the substance of their internal policy on lifts. Now, if we can go to paragraph 404, first of all, which is at page 167. Now, there you refer to an email sent by Janice Ray in July 2010 to the LFB, which sets out the features of a firefighting lift which the TMO lifts did meet, and we see the substance of that email is set out over the page, on page 168. If that could be expanded. And we see at points 2, 3 and 4 refer to a dedicated power supply, a communication system, fire control switch, and finally at point 5 a stainless steel lift car. Would you agree there's no reference there to water protection or a trapdoor?
I agree.
And just repeating a point you gave earlier in evidence, but just to make it clear, if a lift doesn't comply with all the features of a firefighting lift, it cannot be properly classified as a firefighting lift. Is that your view?
That's my view.
Thank you.
And would it, sorry.
Sorry.
Would it be right to understand that a dedicated power supply is not the same as a secondary power supply?
That's correct.
Could we go back in your report to paragraph 376, which is at page 156? And you consider here the TMO's policy on firefighting lifts. Is it right to say that you've seen a number of versions of the relevant policy?
I have, yes.
And all of them refer to the lifts meeting to a lesser or greater extent some, but not all, of the criteria of a firefighting lift. Is that a fair generalisation?
That's a fair generalisation, yes.
Now you note that a version of the policy dating from 2012 states not all of the criteria which define a firefighting lift are appropriate to our lifts. Specifically, for example, the requirement to have a trapdoor on the roof, the lift car, etc., could be detrimental to the safety of our lifts. Now, what is your opinion on the assertion that the requirement to have a trapdoor on the roof could be detrimental to the lift's safety?
It wouldn't have a detrimental factor of the safety. It's not a safety. It's not a safety issue.
But if the concern were on the part of the TMO that the trapdoor could be used to enable unauthorised individuals access to the lift shaft,
That's an individual safety. It's not safety of the lift. It's the safety of the person.
now, if we look at paragraph 381, which is at the bottom of page 159, you identify there another version of the policy dated October 2012, which states this, and we see it quoted there as well. Where appropriate, firefighting lifts, it's probably over the page, are provided within TMO residential blocks. This is to satisfy the requirements of the building regulations because of the height of the building, over 18 metres, etc. When the lifts are installed, they are compliant with the relevant standards current at that time. Similarly, when replacement lifts are installed, these are compliant with the standards current at the time of replacement. Now, is it right that you read that suggesting that firefighting lifts are required in buildings over 18 metres in height?
That's correct.
Now, there are some other iterations of the policy set out in your report, but could we look now at the 2017 edition? And that, if we turn to page 163 in your report, where this is considered. Is it fair to say that the 2017 version of the policy was broadly the same as those others which we've just discussed?
They are broadly the same.
And it contained the same TMO definition of a firefighting lift, which you've criticised in your report and in your oral evidence today?
Yes.
Now, the 2017 version differs in one respect, is it states that lifts being replaced or new lifts being fitted should comply with relevant standards applicable at the time, which would be correct if occurring. Is it right to identify that exception?
Yes, it is.
Now, assuming the TMO applied its own definition of a firefighting lift, what is your assessment of the consequences of their applying a bespoke definition, which was materially inconsistent with relevant standards?
I believe that they're wrong in getting their own definition. Fundamentally, it's the standard is it sets out what the requirement for a firefighting lift is, and that should be adhered to.
From the lay perspective, it seems as if applying a different definition of a firefighting lift to that in relevant standards might cause confusion in the mind of those responsible for health and safety of the lifts, or indeed, crucially, firefighters. Is that lay view reasonable?
It is reasonable. I think the view would be that the fire service would expect all lifts that are firefighting lift to have the same control systems. They wouldn't know in individual buildings. They would expect a firefighting lift to comply with the same standard throughout their area.
Thank you. Can I now turn to Project 2 itself? And just for reference, this is considered at page 176 onwards of your report. If I can summarise the scope of Project 2 thus, and please shout if I get this wrong, but in terms of the lifts, they were adjusted to open on 2 new floors, the walkway +1 and the mezzanine floor, is that right?
That's correct.
And a second fire control switch was installed on the walkway floor.
Correct.
It appears temporarily, though.
I believe so.
Did Project 2, in your view, provide the TMO with an opportunity to consider whether any other works ought to be carried out to the lifts? I'm thinking here of basically enhancing the lifts to firefighting status.
It gave the TMO the opportunity to consider, but I've seen no evidence to say they did consider.
Could I turn to the question, and we've touched upon this earlier, of the automatic fire recall system? Now, that seems to have been installed as part of Project 1. Is that right?
I believe so.
And you set out in your report, and it's paragraph 439 onwards, which can be found at page 177 of your report. That's RHO /00003/177. And you set out there a number of emails which tend to suggest that by 2015, the automatic fire alarm recall system had been disconnected. Is that a fair summary of the material which you consider there?
It is a fair summary, yes.
And that testing carried out after the fire suggested that that system had been disconnected. Again, is that a fair summary of the evidence?
It is a fair summary.
But the emails indicate that at the time there was a degree of confusion as to whether the system had been disconnected or not. Again, is that a fair summary?
It is a fair summary.
Now, in your supplemental report, and the reference is RHO /00005/36, you refer there to further testing which had been carried out by RINA, that's RINA, which confirmed that there was no programmed connection between the lift controller and the smoke extraction system as well. Again, is that a fair summary of your conclusions?
That's a fair summary, yes.
Thank you. Can we now turn to the question of maintenance? Now, we considered what the standards required earlier, and specifically the 1991 standard, which state that the fire control switch should be tested weekly. Am I right in understanding that's the relevant requirement?
That's a relevant requirement.
Now, from the evidence that you reviewed for the purposes of your reports, how often does the switch appear to have been inspected or tested in reality?
There is no evidence to say it has been tested. There's no documents.
At all or weekly?
At all.
Now, if we can turn to Appendix E for Echo, of the 2012 Lift Safety Policy, that can be found at TMO 00849-330/30. Now, if we look at Section 2, which is headed Checks by Staff TMO Senior Lift Engineer, that suggests that the switch should have been checked every month by the TMO Lift Engineer. What evidence have you seen that that obligation was discharged?
I've seen no evidence at all on that.
What level of competence was required in order to test the switch? Could a properly trained caretaker employed by the TMO have carried out that function?
I believe it could have if he had gone through the necessary training and safety procedures and what was expected.
So you didn't need to be a lift technician or engineer in order to carry out the testing of the switch?
I would quite an authorised person could do it.
Now, we don't need to go to it, but at paragraph 463 of your report, and the reference is RHO quadruple 0 trouble 03/181, you note that annual operational testing of the firefighting lift controls in accordance with section C1 of the 1991 standard was not carried out. Can you explain, first of all, what that testing is?
It's the testing we mentioned earlier, that once a year you make sure that the control works, the secondary power supply works, and it complies with all the requirements. It's just an annual. It's probably called better call it an MOT for the fire control switch.
But that only applies if the lift is a firefighting lift.
It does, yes.
And so if they weren't, the obligation doesn't engage. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct.
Now can I turn to a separate topic, which is the involvement of PDERS. Now I understand there are various pronunciations of that, but it's an acronym. I shall describe them as PDERS. Is it right that they were the lift maintenance contractor from the 3rd of February 2014 onwards?
Correct.
Thank you. Now can I turn to the maintenance of the fire control switch again? First of all, can you help us? What was Mr. Wallace's, one of the engineers, maintenance engineers, what was his methodology of testing?
I don't know, to be quite honest.
Well, he's told us, hasn't he?
He has. Well, it's just for context here. But if you accept the evidence of if Mr. Wallace's evidence is accepted on this,
Mr. Wallace did say he tested the fire control switch, yes.
Yeah. What's your view of the adequacy of what he did?
There's no documentation to say he did it. It's just a verbal, his witness statement just says he tested it.
Now, could we go to...
Well, to be fair to Mr. Wallace, I thought we saw some charts in which he marked off the testing.
Yes, if I can just go to some of the maybe well be relevant to this. Now, looking at this topic of recording maintenance checks, have you reviewed the lift maintenance logbooks which contained a maintenance schedule grid?
Yes.
Now, can we go to MET 000-39857/4? This is the logbook for lift H090. Now, looking at that maintenance schedule, does that alter your view or your criticisms of Mr. Wallace's record keeping of maintenance checks?
No, he's doing the check with an annual maintenance schedule, and there's nothing on that checklist to say check the fire control switch.
Can we go, and just for the sake of completeness, can we go to a log which is at MET 000-39857/3? Does that alter or change your view in any way?
No, it doesn't.
And for the same reason you've just given?
Yes.
Now, if we can look at the same document but in respect of lift H091, which is at MET 000-39857/5. Again, you've seen this document before.
I have seen the document before, yes.
Does the content of that document, or what you heard Mr. Wallace say yesterday, alter your opinion in any way?
No, it doesn't.
Have you seen any evidence in the service visit reports that the maintenance engineers ever noted or commented upon the movement of the fire control switch from the ground floor to the walkway and back to the ground floor again.
No, I haven't seen that.
Would you make any criticism of that omission?
No, I'd expect the person that fitted the secondary switch to remove it under Project 2.
Would you have expected the maintenance engineers to have commented upon the disconnected walkway switch?
No,
Because that would have been a job for others, is that
it'd be a
right?
job for others, and they wouldn't know whether that was disconnected or not.
Now, looking at maintenance generally, if we can go to your report, an RHO quadruple 00003 /185 and paragraph 472 onwards, this element of your report sets out your assessment of the regime of maintenance generally, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Can you summarise for the panel your essential views in relation to the adequacy of the maintenance regime?
I think it was adequate for the building, but whether the engineer had enough time to do the work, I'm not sure.
Now, you note there were a number of documents suggesting that residents had concerns regarding the maintenance of the lifts and the quality, and that the TMO were also unhappy with the service. And if we go to paragraph 474, paragraph 474, over the page. And you set out there almost all of the complaints which I reviewed relate to the reliability of the lifts. While there may have been issues with the standard maintenance generally, I have not seen material evidence which suggests that the maintenance of the fire safety features of the lifts was deficient. Does that remain your view?
It still remains my view, yes.
Now, could we go to your supplemental report, which is RHO quadruple 00005 /9 and paragraph 24, you say this: overall, having considered both reports, now to do with maintenance, in my view, Michael Arnold identified a number of defects with lifts H090 and H091. In my opinion, the lifts do not appear to be well kept and maintained, so I disagree with his comment that they demonstrated a good standard of maintenance and upkeep. Does that remain your view?
It still remains my view, yes.
Now, just for the avoidance of doubt, I've taken you through various lift maintenance logbooks, which are at MET 0039857, but there was nothing in that suite of documents which has caused you to alter the views set out.
Nothing at all.
Yeah, thank you. Now, can I turn to the question of an initial survey? And if I go back to your main report, which is RHO quadruple 00003 /190 and paragraph 478. Now there you comment that you would have expected PDERS to have carried out an initial survey on the lifts at Grenfell when they took over the maintenance contract. Now, can you help us? What is the basis of that opinion?
Well, the opinion is that to take over a maintenance contract, I would expect the lift contractor to inspect every lift and look at any defects that may be a part that weren't included in their price.
And in that regard, I think it's right to say that you rely upon clause 780 of the relevant contract, which is summarised here just below your paragraph 478. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
What sort of staff member would have carried out an initial survey? What level of experience and expertise?
I would expected a senior member of staff, not director level, maybe a supervisor, not an engineer or a mechanic.
So a senior technical surveyor, something of
Yes,
that.
I'd expected that.
Is it right that you would have expected PDERS to have assessed whether the lifts were firefighting lifts or not?
I would have expected it during the survey.
And as they were not, would you have expected them, therefore, to have raised that fact with the TMO?
I would expect that, yes.
And did they do that?
As far as I'm aware, no.
Now, if we can turn to paragraph 483 of your report, which is at page 191, you say this, and it's towards the end of the first line: PDERS were not ultimately responsible for ensuring compliance with the relevant standards. Rather, their duty was limited to highlighting compliance as part of the initial survey. It was then up to TMO to choose how to respond. Does that remain your view?
That still remains my view, yes.
So again, as before, when we talk about Apex, ultimately the decision maker was the TMO.
Correct.
Thank you. Can I now turn to Bureau Veritas? You conclude at paragraph 501 of your report, which is at page 193, that Bureau Veritas's inspections were in line with what you'd expect of a statutory engineering inspection. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Now, in your supplemental report, which is at RHO 0000005/5, you considered the evidence of Michael Arnold, who is a Bureau Veritas test engineer who visited Tower on the 10th of April 2017. Is that right?
That's correct.
And as part of that evidence, he described the testing of the fire control switch?
Correct.
Now, in your view, was the testing procedure as described by Mr. Arnold sufficient?
No. He tested the switch to ensure that the lift returned to the ground floor or the fire service access level, but he didn't check to make sure that all the other sub-circuits for a firefighting control were operational.
Now, Mr. Arnold did not enter the lift while testing the fire control switch. He did not test whether the door close feature worked or whether the lift would respond to multiple car calls. Again, was that insufficient or sufficient?
Insufficient.
Notwithstanding those omissions, would Mr. Arnold's testing have detected any significant faults with the fire control switch?
His explanation for testing the switch, he would operate the switch, so the switch would have worked. But that's the limit of it.
And if we can turn over to paragraph 14, at page 6. You say this: although I cannot come to a safe conclusion as to why the lift did not work for firefighters on the 14th of June, I would have expected the testing which Mr. Arnold says he carried out to have picked up a significant fault which would have prevented an operator taking control of the lifts, as happened on the night of the fire. Does that remain your view?
It still remains my view, yes.
Can I now turn to review of the fire control switch? Now, can I ask you to go to your supplemental report, which is at RHO 0000005/48. And if that could be amplified, that is a photograph of a fire control switch, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And the frequently referred to drop key is to the right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And just following on from the Chairman's earlier question as to how the Euro key worked, how does the drop key operate the fire control switch?
The drop key, you would slide it through the drop key tube. The drop key would drop down where it's the drop key labyrinth. There's a micro switch assembly, so when you turn it, it would operate. It would move the plate.
Thank you. And can you explain why the dimensions of the key are important and relevant?
If the drop key is not to the correct size or dimensions, it won't be able to operate through the drop key labyrinth. It'll be able to go through the drop key tube and drop down, but it wouldn't be able to operate the switch through the labyrinth.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to the history?
Can I just ask this, are there different sizes of drop key?
There shouldn't be. There's no standard for it. This was it was designed from the Express Lift Company that got bought out by Otis to their design. So there's no dimensions that we could find out to manufacture.
And were they the only supplier?
They were the only supplier, and now there's a few component people that supply as well.
I presume that while Otis were or Express Lifts were the only supplier, they made them all to the same pattern.
You would imagine so.
Well, do you have any reason to think they didn't?
I would imagine that if you bought it from one of the suppliers from Express, they would be the same size.
Yeah.
Can I now turn to the history of the fire control switch? And paragraph 203 of your principal report, if we can go to that. RHO quadruple 0 000 3 / 203. And paragraph 518. Now, at this section of the report, you note correspondence from 2010, which concerned a fire which the LFB attended at Grenfell Tower, and in which it was noted that the fire control switch did not work. You note the explanation provided by Janice Ray that it was because the lift was overloaded, and you also note the LFB notifiable fire report of the 22nd of December, which can find at IWS quadruple 0 1463 / 2, which noted that the reason for the failure of the fire lift was, quotes, poor maintenance, close quotes. Now, in light of that notifiable fire report, would you change the conclusion, which is at paragraph 528 of this report, and if we go to that, which is at page 205, where you say this, I'm looking at the second line, Janice Ray's evidence is that the firefighters' failure to operate the switch was due to user error. She also comments that they may have overloaded the lift by exceeding the safe working load. There is no evidence to the contrary, and so it is most likely on the evidence that the reason the firefighters could not use the switch was due to a failure to operate the switch correctly. Does that remain your view?
It still remains my view, yes.
Are you able to help us on what you have seen as to why the fire control switch did not work in 2010?
I haven't seen anything why the 2010 incident, why it failed.
Irrespective of what happened or did not happen in 2010, is your view that the evidence suggests that as the lifts were tested many times after the incident and worked, any problem with the fire control switch was limited to that night?
I believe it was.
Thank you. Now, can I turn to Project 2? As we've discussed, the purpose of the project was to extend the lifts to the mezzanine and the walkway +1 floors. You also note that during these works, the entrance of the building was moved from the ground floor to the walkway. Is that right?
That's correct.
And a second fire control switch was found, disconnected, but still attached to the wall on the walkway at Grenfell Tower after the fire. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so your interpretation of this evidence, taken with the other material set out in your report, is that the second fire control switch was likely installed temporarily during Project 2 whilst the ground floor was out of action.
I believe it was.
And that once the work was finished, the fire control switch on the walkway floor was disconnected and the ground floor switch was reconnected.
Correct.
Is your view that the second switch that had been disconnected, is your view that it was liable to confuse firefighters in the event of their attending to fight a fire?
It could have.
Do you have any evidence that it did?
No.
If we turn to your supplemental report, which can be found at RHO quadruple 0 0005 / 33. You refer to an email there between two LFB employees from July 2014, and I'll just invite you to read it. But suffice to say, your view is that the contents of that email support the view set out in your main report that the fire control switch was temporarily moved away.
That's correct.
Thank you. Now can I turn to the evidence of firefighters as to the use of the switch on the night of the fire itself. And that is addressed in paragraph 543 onwards of your report, which can be found at RHO quadruple 0 003 /2007. Am I right in thinking that this section of your report is the result of your review of the witness statements and the oral evidence of firefighters who attended on the 14th of June?
That's correct.
And that the principal source of evidence you looked at was from crew manager Secret?
That's correct.
And that, as set out in this section, apologies for summarising, he explained that soon after his arrival at the tower at 01:01 a.m, he attempted to take control of the lift by putting his drop key into the fire control switch and turning it. Is that a fair summary of your understanding of his evidence?
That's a very fair summary.
And his and Secret's evidence was that when he put the key in, it hit some sort of stop. He said that it felt like it wasn't connecting to the mechanism, it wasn't working. As a result, the firefighters called the lift in the normal way. Again, is that a fair summary?
That's a
of
fair
your
summary.
understanding of the
It
evidence?
is, yes.
And you also note, and if we turn to page 210, you also note, as you can see there, the evidence of crew manager Gallagher and firefighter Nuttall, which you set out there. Which you
Yes.
set.
Yes, I do.
And just to draw out the evidence of firefighter Nuttall, he was seen removing the key from the fire control switch at the tower, but ultimately he did not know what had happened to that key. Is that a fair summary of your understanding?
That's a very fair summary.
And he cannot be sure that the key he eventually posted to the police was the same key that was removed from Grenfell Tower. Again, is that a fair summary of your understanding?
That's a fair summary, yes, it is.
Now can we turn to the examination of the switch itself, which is at section Q3 of your report, which is at paragraphs 550 onwards, and that details the various examinations of the switch that were carried out after the fire. Now, the first one I'd like to discuss with you is the WSP report, and that was an independent site inspection report carried out for the Metropolitan Police, and it's dated August 2018. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that was set out at Appendix 3 of your report, which can be found at RHO quadruple 0 004 /88. Is that right?
That's correct.
You weren't involved in the writing of that report, were you?
No, I wasn't.
And you weren't present at the relevant testing?
No, I wasn't.
Am I right in understanding that WSP removed and tested the fire control switches found on the ground floor and on the walkway floor?
I'm not sure about testing. They definitely removed them.
And in relation to the ground floor switch, the switch which the firefighters tried to use, they found was too difficult to operate with the drop key, and the mechanism was seized and or deformed. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary, yes.
Now, if we go to your supplemental report, which is RHO quadruple 0 005 /46, and if we look at paragraph 151, you note that you cannot comment further on WSP's findings as you are not present at the testing. Therefore, you don't know what deformation they observed, the level of debris present, or the type of key used. Does that remain your view?
That still remains my view, yes.
Were you able to review the photos taken by WSP in any further detail?
Yes, I was.
And can we go to MET 000 78672? Now, this photo was taken by WSP, and it shows a close-up of the fire control switch itself. Is there anything which you can see in this close-up picture of the switch which affects or informs your opinion?
The sidewalls on that switch are definitely deformed.
And to that extent, supports at least the conclusion of deformation reached by WSP?
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, you say the sidewall. Is that the? Do we see that in the line that's running left to right at an angle about 45 degrees in the plate.
Now, if I can help, where there's a tube at the bottom of that plate that's 45 degrees, there's a tube which is rectangular.
Yeah.
If you go up about a third, there's a piece of metal which is deformed. It bends.
Yeah.
It bends out.
That's it. I think we're talking about the same thing.
Oh, okay.
I didn't describe it.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now can I turn to the second testing exercise, which was carried out on the 15th of February 2019, and that's considered and addressed in an ARIP briefing note and Andre Horn's report. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
And you explained the findings of further examinations. The ARIP briefing note is at Appendix 5 of your report, and it was dated the 1st of March 2019. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the testing took place on the 15th of February 2019 at BRE.
That's correct.
Were you present?
I was present.
Now, this testing, the switch recovered from the ground floor of the tower was compared to an exemplar switch. Is that right?
That's correct.
Could we go to RHO quadruple 0 treble 04 /231? What do these photographs show us?
If you take the top pair of photographs, you see on the left hand you see the deformed sideboards, where on the right hand one is the exemplar straight from the supplier, and they're straight.
Now, in February 2019, what was considered to be the likely cause of the deformation of the walls as illustrated by the left-hand side photographs?
It was considered that an incorrect object key was used to operate the switch.
Is it right that the switch was also jammed?
The switch was jammed, yes.
Now, bearing in mind that evidence, if we could just go back to your supplemental, or go back to your supplemental report, RHO quadruple 0 treble 05 /48. And if the photograph at the top can be expanded, it's the one we looked at earlier on. What are the blue arrows identifying for us?
They identified where the micro switch is, where there was debris observed.
Now, just help us on this. The top blue arrow, is pointing to one of the places where debris was observed.
Yes.
And it appears to be a flat plate, is that right?
That's correct.
And would we be right in understanding that when the key is operated, it bears on the horizontal extension of the plate in front of the labyrinth?
Yes.
And turns the micro switch
That's
as a
correct.
result of working the plate?
That's it, yes.
And the switch itself is below. We can see that in the diagram. And debris was observed on the uppermost surface of the plate where it's identified. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And also below the plate, but I can't see at the moment what it was resting on.
That is actually the electrical. That is a micro switch. It was round the switch. The plastic housing.
Right. And when the switch is operated, I take it that the vertical pin that you can see turns. Is that right?
It's a toggle switch.
Well, the pin turns.
That's it.
And it turns the switch within the housing, either where marked electrical micro switch or within the black area. But I mean, the debris below the level of the plate, in other words, where it's shown on the lower blue arrow, would not actually affect the turning of the spindle. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. Right. It was just shown where they on the inspection where we saw debris.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Now, the testing process that was undertaken, that someone inserted a drop key into the switch. Is that right?
That's correct.
You weren't the individual who did that.
No.
But the person who did was what you described as an adult of ordinary strength.
Yes.
Now, that person inserted the key into the switch, and is it right that at first the switch did not operate?
That's correct.
With some manipulation, the debris on the microswitch cleared. Is that right?
That's correct.
And by manipulation, what did you mean?
I mean, turning the key backwards and forwards.
Was anything else done to clear the debris?
Nothing at all.
Can you usefully assist the panel on what degree of force was applied by the individual who inserted the key into the switch? If not, say so.
I can't say what force it was because I don't know. It was an adult man. He wasn't trying to force it. He was just manipulating back and forwards. So I don't know what force was applied to it.
What debris was found?
It was about half to 3/4 of a spoonful of builder's rubbish. May look like plaster, to be quite honest. But I'm not a non-materials expert.
Dare I ask what size spoon?
A teaspoon
Right, thank you.
That was the next question.
of normal size.
And just so that we've understood this correctly, this is a sealed unit, is it, apart from the aperture at the top for the wiring entry and the aperture for the drop key?
That's correct. That would go into a back box.
Yeah.
Now, WSP were unable to operate the switch during their site visit in April 2018, but in February 19, it was possible to operate the switch. Are you able to help us as to why WSP were unable to do so? If you can't say, please say so.
They were assisting the Metropolitan Police, so I don't know. They may have been advised by the Metropolitan Police not to, just to remove it.
Now, you also refer in your report to a report prepared by Andre Horn, dated the 12th of November 2019. And that report started by describing the testing that was carried out on the 15th of February, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, Mr. Horn comes to the same conclusion, that forceful manipulation of a fitting key would have moved the switch frame arms. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct.
And anticipating a question the chairman may ask, switch frame arms is a reference to the micro switch.
No, it would be the labyrinth,
Thank you.
the sideboards.
In your supplemental report at paragraph 170, and we can find it at page 50, so just
I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, Mr. Kinnear, but it's quite important that we get as good a picture as we can of this from whatever source. You told us a moment ago, Mr. Howkins, that there was about 1/2 to 3/4 of a teaspoon of debris. Was that all from one place or in one place, or is that the total of the two debris in the two places you've marked?
That was from the debris from the two places we marked.
So the total amount of debris
Yes.
came to 1/2 to 3/4 of a teaspoon.
If I can explain, when the force manipulation went, there was on a workbench at BRE, and that's what we found on the bench after it moved.
Right. And had it all cleared from the box?
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, if we can go to page 50 in your supplemental report, and it's paragraph 170. You say this: I cannot say when the switch became jammed, i.e. whether it was before the fire, during the fire, after the fire, but before the removal of the switch from the building, or after the removal of the switch from the building. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary, yes.
But that overall your conclusions are set out in paragraph 171, and they are threefold. First of all, there was debris found on the switch which caused it to jam, but it could have been cleared, and was in fact cleared with manipulation with a fitting key. Is that right?
That's correct.
Secondly, if an express drop key of the incorrect dimensions had been used, the fire control switch would not have worked, regardless of whether there was debris present or not. Is that right?
Yes.
Finally, on the night of the fire, if the debris you observed had been present and an express drop key of the correct dimensions had been used, it should not have prevented use of the fire control switch, but it may have increased the time needed to operate that switch. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment, yes.
Now can I turn to the third and final element of testing that was carried out, and that is set out in a University of Northampton report. Now, you explain in your own main report that the switch was sent to the University of Northampton for further testing, and the results of that are set out in a report dated the 27th of October 2019. Is that right?
That's correct.
Were you present for that round of testing?
No, I wasn't.
And again, is it right to say that an exemplar fire control switch was tested and that had been obtained from A&A Electrical, who Mr. Pointer thought were the manufacturers of the switch?
That's correct.
Now, is it right that the principal findings, indeed I think there are 8, of the University of Northampton's testings are those which are set out in paragraph 560 of your main report at page 214? And if we can go to that. And if 560 could be expanded. Are those the key findings at the University of Northampton?
They are, yes.
And I think they also found that the sidewards and switch frame arm were bent due to the use of an ill-fitting key and the use of excessive force. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we could go to paragraph 565, which is at page 215 of your main report. Your conclusion is that it is or seems unlikely that the jam or the bent sidewards could have caused the fire control switch to fail if a fitting key had been used. Does that remain your view?
That still remains our view, yes.
Now, if I could look at your consideration of the drop key that was used on the night of the fire, and if I could ask you to turn to page 217 in this report. And if we can go to page 221 in particular, and paragraph 596. And cutting to the chase, your view is this, that I do not consider that there is sufficient evidence for me to come to a safe conclusion as to which lift drop key was used on the night of the fire. Does that remain your view?
It still remains our view, yes.
Could we go to paragraph 581, which is at page 218. And we see there, those are the various possibilities you considered in reaching the view, which is at paragraph 596.
That's correct.
Thank you. Can I now turn to the topic of why the lifts failed on the night, possibly the core question arising here. And we were discussing earlier on the report prepared by Andre Horn from November 2019. And if we could go to RHO quadruple 0 treble 0 4 /257. Now, Mr. Horn describes there in somewhat dense type the testing that took place on the 29th of July 2019. Were you present for that?
No, I wasn't. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that one, yes, I was.
Yes.
Apologies.
And the principal points arising from this report are those set out, sorry for leaping about, but in your main report at RHO quadruple 0 treble 0 3 218. Through to 219, and really set out at paragraph 584 onwards, that the exemplar key was tested on the fire control switch recovered from the tower. Is that right?
That's correct.
The key did not work easily, but if sufficient force was applied, it could be used.
Correct.
This key could have caused the damage to the side wards which was observed.
Correct.
The key labelled LJH67, so that's the key that was sent by firefighter Nuttall, was also tested. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we go to paragraph 592 at page 220, does that paragraph set out the results of the testing using that key?
It does.
And if we could go to paragraph 595 at page 221, and if we'd amplify the top row, which is LJH/7, which was the key provided by Firefighter Nuttall, the conclusions were that its dimensions were so grossly different that the key was unusable. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And the key could be inserted into the fire control switch, but it could not be turned. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it could have caused the damage which is observed to the sideboards. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
Now, Mr. Horn carried out further testing on the 7th of February 2020, and the results of that are set out in reports dated the 15th of May and the 28th of August 2020. Were you present for those later rounds of testing?
No, I wasn't.
And is it right that Mr. Horn tested another 2 drop keys, one which had been provided by the LFB and another purchased from eBay?
That's correct.
And if we summarise his key conclusions thus, all the keys were of different sizes.
Correct.
The key provided by Ricky Nuttall was very significantly different in its dimensions.
Correct.
The key provided by Ricky Nuttall was so different in dimension that when put in the fire control switch, it could not be turned.
Correct.
That key could not have caused the damage to the sideboards observed in the switch removed from the Grenfell Tower, but the damage could have been caused before the fire and would not have prevented a fitted key from working.
Correct.
So is it fair to say that drawing out those strands of the evidence, there were 3 explanations as to why firefighters were unable to take control of the lift on the night, and these are set out at paragraph 598 of your report at page 222. And we see them there. Possibility 1, crew manager secret was unable to take control of the lifts as a lift drop key of incorrect dimensions was used, which could not operate the switch. CM secret was unable to take control of the lifts as the fire control switch was faulty in some other unidentified way. And 3, CM secret was unable to take control of the lifts as the fire had affected the lifts such that the fire control switch did not work. Now, are you able to assist the inquiry as to which possibility you consider to be more likely than not?
Possibility 1 is my most likely.
And if we turn over to look at paragraph 5.
Well, ultimately that, of course, is a question for us. But what might be helpful is to know whether there are technical reasons which tend to point in one direction rather than...
That's what I was... If I could come on to that
All right.
in due course, sir. Can we look at paragraph 599? Now, here you set out a number of observations to assist the panel, which are, I think, you consider relevant to the likelihood of the relevant possibilities. First of all, that CM Secret attempted to take control of the lifts at an early stage, and the lifts continued to operate normally for some time after this. Is that right?
That's correct.
Secondly, none of the forensic reports or examinations disclosed any fire-related or smoke-related damage to the fire control switch. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that is particularly relevant when considering the possibility of heat damage, so i.e. possibility 3.
Correct.
And the witness evidence of engineers from Bureau Veritas and PDERS, which you set out in the report, is that they tested the fire control switch before the fire and did not identify any faults. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, having set out those observations, and if we can go back up to paragraph 598, whilst this is a matter solely for the panel, are you able to provide your opinion as to which of those possibilities you consider to be more likely than not?
I'm still of the opinion that possibility 1 is the most likely cause.
If the fire control switch had been code compliant and operable by means of the Euro triangle key, would that have made any difference, or are you unable to assist the panel on that point?
If a Euro key had been provided to operate the switch, yes, it would have been easier because it's a standard key.
Now, can I turn to the final question, which is performance of the lifts on the night. This is dealt with at section R of your report and page 224 onwards. If we can go to paragraph 603 at page 224. Now, there you explain that the evidence from phase one, and this is in broad terms obviously, is that a number of residents use the lifts to escape from the tower. Is that right?
That is correct.
And that from paragraph 604 onwards, you note that the lifts were also associated with a number of fatalities as residents tried to use the lifts to escape. Is that right?
That is correct.
Had the fire brigade been able to take control of the lifts, they may not necessarily have been able to be used by residents to escape, but would residents have been protected in other ways?
The requirement is that you don't use lifts in the event of a fire. So I would assume that the residents would use the staircases.
Now, if we can go to page 226, you set out here a number of lift controller logs. I suppose the key question is, were you able to extract anything useful from those logs?
No.
And why was that?
They were extracted by WSP. It was taken from the controller when it was taken to the examination, and there's a lot of incidents around 1.15. There could be people holding the doors. It could be people pressing the buttons and holding the door, holding the call station. So we know that lifts, assuming the timing on the controller is correct, the lifts were running.
And if we can scroll forward to paragraph 635. Thank you. You set out your conclusions here. Is it fair to summarise the position thus, that the most that can be said is that both lifts appear to have become stuck on the 10th floor, with lift H090 recording its final event at 0307?
Correct.
And that lift 091 recording its final event at 0233 hours?
Correct.
And that you go on to conclude in 635.2, and I quote, on the night of the fire, the lifts were operational according to the WSP report until approximately 0307 hours. Lift 8090 left-hand lift and 0231 lift 8091 right-hand lift. During this period, the residents and firefighters at Grenfell Tower were able to use these lifts. Does that remain your view?
It still remains my view, yes.
Am I right in understanding that you're not able to assist the panel on the spread of smoke into the lifts?
That's correct.
And so you're unable to assist them as to whether, and if so, when, lifts might have become unusable due to smoke spread?
That's correct.
Thank you. Sir, I've come to the end of my prepared questions. I'd be grateful for an opportunity to see, most likely if there are some matters which I haven't covered, which I ought to, and see whether there are any other relevant questions from CPs.
Yes. Now, we're getting close to the time at which we would normally break for lunch, but I think it would be helpful to try and complete Mr. Howkins' evidence as soon as we can. I expect you feel the same, Mr. Howkins, don't you?
Yes.
I'll take it you would. So how long do you think you might need for this? 10 minutes or more?
Could I have until 1:10?
Yes.
And then if I need more time or less time, then I'd ask the usher to contact you.
Well, Mr. Howkins, as I think you know, when counsel gets to the end of his questions, we have to have a break to give him a chance to check that nothing's been overlooked, and also give a chance to others who are following from other places a chance to suggest additional questions which perhaps we ought to ask you. So we'll break now until 1:10. We'll come back at 1:10 and see whether there are any further questions for you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
And in the meantime, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You'd like to go with the usher? Very well, Mr. Kinnear, 1:10.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah. Would you ask Mr. Howkins to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Howkins. Well, we'll see if there are more questions for you. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Sir, thank you. Just a few. Mr. Howkins, are you in a position to comment on Mr. Morehouse's assessment of the cost of enhancing the existing lifts to give them firefighting status? The figure he put on it, and he very much emphasised it was an approximate estimate, was between £70,000 and £100,000. Are you able to comment on the reasonableness of that figure?
No, I'm not. It was a long time ago, so I don't know what the costs would be.
Are you able to assist in any way on costings of the various upgrades that have been discussed in evidence today?
On Mr. Ellis's evidence, he gave costings for some minor items, which I think were reasonable.
Thank you.
That was fire control switch, waterproofing.
Thank you. Now, you suggested that the WSP investigator may not have tested the fire control switch when located in Grenfell Tower. Could we go to your main report and page 212? So that's RHO 0000003/212. And this is where you set out findings, and we see at paragraph 555 the following findings were made on page 16 of the WSP report. If we can turn over the page, we see a conclusion that the fireman's switch was difficult to operate. Given that, is it fair to take it that the WSP investigator did try and operate the fire control switch?
Yes, I believe you could interpret it that way.
Thank you. And that he discovered as a result of that the mechanism was seized, damaged and deformed, as you set out in your evidence.
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Howkins, sir, those are all the questions I have for you. So it leaves me, Mr. Howkins, to say thank you very much for attending today.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kinnear. Well, Mr. Howkins, it's right that I should thank you very much on behalf of all three members of the panel, not just for your coming here to give evidence today, which we've, I think, all found very interesting and very helpful, but also for all the work that's gone into your major report and the supplemental report. They're very informative and very helpful, and we are very grateful to you indeed. Thank you.
It's been a very useful exercise for me as well.
Good.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, thank you, and that's all we have for you, so you are now free to go. A little later than probably you'd hope, but at least you're away now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Kinnear, I understand that the witness we were hoping to call next is not available for medical reasons, and that means that we shall have to stop the hearing at this point for today.
Unfortunately, that's right, sir.
And it also means that we shan't have any witness tomorrow, I understand.
That is right.
So we will break now and we'll resume next week, Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Is that right?
Yes, with Abigail Acosta.
Good. Thank you very much. So Monday morning next week at 10 o'clock, please.
Thanks, sir.